Next we'll do number 238.
story one time of a relative that he had. And this relative that he had was, in fact, his uncle. And his uncle, at one point or another in his life, had 3 young boys. And at this point, one point in his life, he decided that he didn't want to have the responsibility of taking care of his family anymore. He didn't want the responsibility of supporting them. He didn't want the responsibility of having a job and having to keep up with the stresses that are involved in that. He didn't want a lot of the responsibility that came along with a family and being a husband and being a father and being a son and so many other responsibilities that he took on. And so he decided that he was just going to run off. He was going to live his own life. He was going to have freedom. He was going to do whatever he wanted to do and not be held down to his family or where he was living or his job or anything like that. And so his life goes on, and for a lot of years his boys start to grow up and they go to college and they start to have their own lives. And the father comes back and he wants to try to kind of reintroduce himself to his family. He realizes what he's done to his family. He's come to the reality that he should have been there all along. He should have helped raise his boys and all of the things that had to go along with being a father and a husband in this family. And so as he comes back, his wife starts to explain kind of the story to him of the 3 boys. And the first boy, the youngest one, ending in prison because he was trafficking cocaine. And he got into the drug scene, and his life very quickly fell apart because of that. The second oldest boy, the middle child, was on his way home from work. He was riding his bike. His life had been kind of overtaken by drugs and by alcohol, and so he was riding his bike from work, and he owed someone a lot of money for the drugs that he had been taking. And so since he was so in debt, this guy decided that he was going to take his life, and so the drug dealer ran him over with his car because that was the price he had to pay for not paying back all the money. And the last brother, the oldest brother, was living life pretty well. He was doing all right, and he had a son that he had to take care of. He was special needs, and so he had to be at home a lot, taking care of his son and supporting his family in those particular needs. And one day he was found cheating by his wife, and his wife grabs a shotgun in an attempt to shoot him, but misses and shoots the woman. And now his wife is in the Florida State Penitentiary. And after he heard this whole story, as this whole story kind of unfolded in front of him, he couldn't forgive himself. He couldn't forgive himself of what he did. He couldn't forgive himself for not being there. He couldn't forgive himself of all of these things. And I think most importantly, he struggled with being able to forgive, or allowing God to forgive him. He didn't think that God could forgive him for what he did. He thought it was so bad, and he had neglected so much of spending time with his family and helping teach his boys how to be men, and most importantly, how to be godly men, and therefore their families replicating that, and they pulling on the identity of Christ. No longer was he there to help them do that. And so he felt the responsibility, he felt the burden of that, and didn't ever think that God could forgive him for that. He thought he was down and out. And I don't necessarily think tonight that many of us can exactly compare to that story. But I do think that we can compare our lives and maybe even understand that feeling that he was in. A feeling of, my back's against the wall, I'm hopeless, I'm helpless, I don't know what to do. I'm lost. There's nothing that I can do to get myself out of the situation that I put myself in. Nothing on my own strength. I can't do anything to get myself out of this spot in life. How does it feel when you hit one of those rock bottom situations? What are the things that go racing through our heads in these situations. In Joshua chapter 1, we read about Joshua. And Joshua has now just taken over the Israelite people. Moses passed on, and so Joshua has to take up two positions now. He has to take over the position as the spiritual leader, the first and foremost, the most important spot that he was going to take over, that he made sure that Israel was faithful to God, that they worshiped God, that their eyes were always focused on Him. And second important role that he takes over as leader is the military role. He's going to lead them into the promised land that God promised Abraham so long ago. It's finally coming to the surface. It's finally happening. These people can finally have freedom from all of the slavery that they had been in. And so as they look forward, as they look to this promised land that God had promised them and they knew was coming, Joshua had to lead them in to wipe out all the Canaanites. And this is going to be a big, big task for Joshua. But Joshua was the man, right? He was the perfect man to step up and to take this spot for Moses. He was very close to Moses, the relationship that they had. Joshua also was one of the 12 spies that came back and said, you know what, we can take over this land. The people aren't too big because our God is bigger. And yet in this situation, in Joshua chapter 1, we see where God, time and time again, He's reminded, be strong and courageous. Do not buckle to fear. Don't crumble because of this position, or you don't feel adequate to fill this position. And so in Joshua chapter 2, this taking over of Canaan starts. Coming into the promised land is about to start. And as Joshua and the Israelites enter into the Canaan land, they find that the first city they're going to have to take over is Jericho. And so as they enter in, they find Jericho, and Joshua, as any good military leader, sends 2 spies in to kind of figure out what's going on. What's the best way to attack this city? How can we win? And so these 2 spies go into town, and I don't know how they get found out. I don't know if it's because they dress a little funny, if they don't dress exactly like all the rest of the people. I don't know if it's because they didn't talk like the rest of the people. You know, I think of when I went to Mississippi and I first stepped foot, I talked to Lauren's dad, and he had the most redneck accent I've ever seen. Lauren, after she spent time with her family, sounded like a redneck, sounded exactly like a hick, and you could call it out from a mile away, exactly what she sounded like. Like she had this thick southern accent. And being from Texas, I guess I had an accent, not really, but it was very distinct. And so I don't know if they got pulled out because they had this thick southern accent or whatever, but something made the people kind of wonder why they were so different. These people kind of wondered why they might have dressed differently or talked differently or walked a little bit differently. Maybe the town was so small that they knew everyone, and so they knew, you know what, those guys stick out. And so whoever kind of rats them out and goes to the king and tells the king that there's 2 spies in Jericho. And so the king sends out his guards to go and find these 2 guys, and these guys find Rahab's house, and Rahab hides them up on top of her roof, and as she comes down, these guards come into her house, and they ask her if she knows where these men went, and instead of saying, oh yeah, I do, she spares them and says, no, I think they ran out the front gate. I think if you ran out of it right now, that you could catch them, you could get them right away. And so she tells this lie, right, to help these 2 Israelite men out. And that's where we get to verse 8 of Joshua chapter 2. In verse 8 of Joshua chapter 2, it says, before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, listen, our hearts melted. And there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is a God in the heavens and above, the heavens above and on the earth beneath. I wonder what it felt like for Rahab to say those words in verse 11, that their hearts melted. They knew what was coming. They good and well knew, after all of the miraculous things that had happened in Egypt, the 10 plagues, and God releasing the Israelites out of over 400 years of slavery, finally they get to leave Egypt, not on their own strength, but because of God. For all of those years that they were enslaved by the Egyptians, there was no possible way they could have gotten out. Because the Egyptians would just kill their male firstborn so they couldn't grow and get bigger and finally take over Egypt or have enough power or manpower or strength to get out. They were at the mercy of someone else to deliver them. And as they leave, we recall the story and remember that Moses, because of God, parts the Red Sea and they walk across on dry ground. And as the Egyptians come running through to take them back, the water swallows them up. God once again shows his power. He shows himself as a redeemer and a reconciler. And Rahab knows that. She doesn't just kind of put that to the back of her mind and wonder about what will happen when Israel attacks Jericho. No, very well so. She knows the outcome. She knows for a fact that if God is behind his people, his children, there's nobody is going to stand in their way, no matter how big the army might have been. No one was going to stand in their way and keep them from taking what God had promised them. Rahab knew that she was going to have her life ended. There was nothing she could do about it. Her back was against the wall. She's in a helpless situation. There was nothing that on her own, with her own strength or power or intellect, there was nothing she could do. There was nothing she could do to save her family and keep her family safe. There was nothing she could do to keep her town from being taken over. They're in this hopeless situation. And so what does she do? She's the least likely person to have done this very thing. She's a very promiscuous person. She gave herself up for money. She would have been the scum of the earth. Nobody would have wanted to have a relationship with her of any kind. No one would have wanted to be seen talking to her or interacting with her, let alone being around her. She had a completely nasty, disgusting past that nobody wanted to even know her. And this defined who she was. And when her back's against the wall, she was probably the least likely person to have done this very thing of throwing herself on the mercy seat of God. If there was someone I had to pick from this entire story to have gone before God and said, you know what, save the people of Jericho, or let alone just the family of Rahab and herself, I would have put Joshua up there. Or just maybe one of the Israelite people before I ever put someone from Canaan. And even if we had to dig down deeper and go into Canaan, it would not have been Rahab. Her background was too disgusting. Her background was too muddied to even think that she had a chance at throwing herself on the mercy seat of God and that he would listen. That he would pour grace and mercy on this very woman. So what do we do when we're down and out? I think we allow Christ to break our hearts and remove all the calluses away. All the calluses that have developed because of sin, and allow Him to work on our hearts, to mold our hearts, to be His workmanship. When you find yourself constantly running back to sin, to pride, being judgmental, are you throwing yourself on the mercy seat of God? And it isn't something that we have to do with hesitation or with doubt that He's even going to listen to us. Because if Rahab was going to throw herself on the mercy seat of God in this very instance to save her and her family, there was probably a lot of doubt in her mind, saying, this is the last resort. This is all I can do for God to hopefully drag me out of this situation, to save me out of this situation. But there's one detail that makes it a little trickier in this situation. God, before they had come into Jericho, set a ban on all of the Canaanite people. And this ban was to kill everyone that they came in contact with, to have complete destruction, that no one would live. And so, to deepen her doubt a little bit more, knowing what God could do because of the previous things that He had done, I'm sure she hesitated a little bit, but she knew there was no other way out. So I think we start where Rahab did. I think we start where she did by throwing herself on the mercy seat of God. In Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 16, even a little bit before that, there's a lot of confidence that can be found in some of these verses. In Hebrews chapter 4, starting in verse 14, since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness. We don't have one who's not able to sympathize when we're struggling with temptation. One who struggles with being judged, one who struggles with being humiliated or mocked because of what he believes. No, he can relate. When temptation feels just too strong, he can relate. When we want to give in because the world is pressing against us, he knows how that feels. But one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. And notice verse 16. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in times of need. So what do? I think we start by humbling ourselves. Understanding that I can't do this on my own. Understanding that I absolutely need God to get me through this situation. I need Him to drag me out of these situations because I can't with my own strength. Getting on our knees and praying. Throwing ourselves on the mercy seat of God, knowing with confidence that He will give us what we need. I think becoming vulnerable with Him will serve a great purpose in our life. Not holding back that one sin or that one thing that feels like we can kind of keep that because we're human or because that's what we derive pleasure from or that's our desire or that's our want. But opening up that closet and letting all the bones out of the closet and being vulnerable with God. No more barriers protecting myself from God and the judgment and the grace and the mercy that He's going to pour, He can and will pour on us if we open up our hearts. But after we throw ourselves on the mercy seat of God, where do I go? What now? What next? What's the next step? A moment ago we talked about the ban, and in this situation the ban is kind of a hard thing to take in. Because God, again, told that all the Canaanites were to be killed. Women, children, men. And it's hard to see God as someone who would pass that over these people. it's hard for sometimes to look at, a lot of people have looked at the Old Testament God versus the New Testament God. They think the Old Testament God is this angry God who wants to just rid the world of all this sin and evil and for only His people to make it through, only His people to live and to glorify Him. And so they see this angry God in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, we see this compassionate God, this merciful God, this God that shows grace and that loves mankind. But I think we see all of those components of God's very character within the ban. Because this ban was put in place because if these people went into Jericho and instead of taking it over simply just took all these people captive, these people bring their religious ideas with them. They served gods, little g. It was the same influence of religion that these Egyptians had. All of these different gods of water, of sun, of the animals, all these different gods that they were probably influenced by because of Egyptian culture, the same thing was going to happen with the Canaanites. And God didn't want that. God didn't want His people to lose their focus. They would be corrupted if they lived side by side with these people. And you see the perfect display of this in 1 Kings chapter 11. King Solomon. He has 700 wives and 300 concubines who aren't Israelite women. And God commanded that they be from Israel. And what happens? His mind's corrupted because he lives side by side with sin. He lives side by side with these little g gods. And not only does he start to worship these gods and idols, but he even builds temples for them. He builds high places for his wives to then sacrifice to these gods, to worship these gods. And his heart is completely sunken into worshiping these gods. No longer is his focus on Yahweh, but now they're focused on idols and things thought of by man. And so instead of walking side by side with sin in our own lives, instead of letting the sin in our life, instead of letting the doubt just kind of fester within our minds that the devil kind of feeds us over and over, day after day, instead of believing the biggest lie that the devil is ever going to tell us is that we can do this life on our own, instead of believing those things, instead of accepting those things and living just a little too close to sin, God wants us to intentionally follow Him in every intricate detail of our lives. To completely separate yourself with sin and put on that new life and be committed to Him. However, I think lastly, we need to remember Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 31. There's a glimpse of hope for Rahab. As the story fills out, the Israelites come in and they take out all of Jericho except for Rahab and her family. Even though these spies weren't the ones that should have let that ban kind of slip over Rahab and her family, even though they weren't the ones that could have said, yeah, we won't kill you since you saved our lives. That was only God who could have done that. But because of the mercy and the grace of God, and Rahab throwing herself on the mercy seat of God, we see that God saves her life. And that she becomes a part of Israel. She becomes a part of God's children. If you notice in Hebrews chapter 11, a lot of times we call this the Hall of Faith, or these great giants in the faith that we see throughout the Bible. But notice who we see in Hebrews chapter 11. You see all of these great names. You see Abraham and all of these great people who had a tremendous amount of faith. You see Abel. You see Noah. You see Abraham. But notice who you see in verse 31. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. God can do the same thing with us. Even when we have put ourselves in this helpless situation, this situation where we've dug ourselves in this hole that we can't get our lives out of, God can do the same thing with us. He can turn a bad background into a positive future. There was nowhere for Christ to have gone in this situation. There was nowhere, for Rahab to have gone except for Christ, except for God. The very one who could sympathize with her. There's a song, a Christian song that I've listened to, and the lyrics go like this. "In all the hearts who are content, and all who feel unworthy, and all who hurt with nothing left, will know that you are holy. And all will sing out, hallelujah, shout it, go on and scream it from the mountaintops, go on and tell it to the masses that He is God." If you look at the lineage of Jesus, the only perfect person that ever lived in this world, the perfect example, the one who came down and faced temptation and faced the world so that we knew that we could get through this life, that He could sympathize with us. You see Rahab's name. You see Rahab in the lineage of Christ. And so when we feel down and out, when we feel helpless and like our backs are against the wall and like there is nothing that we can possibly do, God will show us grace. When we humble ourselves, when we get on our knees and we pray, and when we're vulnerable with Him, wanting to separate ourselves from sin, not continue to walk side by side with sin, rather completely separate and faithfully serve Him 100%, God will show us grace. And God can give grace out on His own terms, even when we don't understand, because God showed grace and showed mercy to Rahab, who even though was under the ban, who was supposed to be killed by the Israelite army, He still showed grace. He still showed mercy. Tonight, if there is anything you need, come forward as we stand and as we sing this song.
I can will
Are there anybody here tonight that needs to take the Lord's Supper? And then, after we sing one verse, number 76, will we let him close in prayer? Blessed be the time that binds our hearts in Christian love. Let's pray.